All right, we're going to discuss just an overview of intangibles, and this is a little bit different than something like leases or bonds or pensions, where we're just discussing one thing. Even though it says intangibles, it seems like one thing. It's actually there's actually different types of intangibles. So the way I've structured this discussion is we're going to talk about the acquisition accounting, when we recognize an asset, an intangible asset, and for how much. Expensing, which is going to be amortization. So remember, amortization is like depreciation, but for intangibles and financial instruments. So it's a reduction in those accounts, systematic reduction in those accounts. So we'll talk about when and how that occurs. The disposal accounting. So just like with a truck, if you sell it, how do you deal with that, and is there a gain or loss? And then finally, impairment. So impairment becomes super important with intangibles when they're not amortized, because the only way an asset's value is going to be reduced is through proper impairment testing when it's not amortized. So impairment testing is important in a lot of different places in accounting, for property and equipment, for example, for financial instruments. However, super important here, again, because some intangibles aren't amortized. So impairment is a general term. It, just like amortization is a general term, doesn't just apply to intangibles. So it's a, in US GAAP, it's a reduction in balance of a long-term asset held at cost. So if it were held at fair value, its value is reduced whenever the fair value is reduced. So and generally, with a few exceptions, we don't talk about impairment for assets that are fair valued. And once it's written down under US GAAP, it's generally, once again, with few exceptions, not reversible. Not true under IFRS. It is reversible under IFRS, but currently under US GAAP, these impairments are what we call asymmetric, is that you write them down and you don't get to write them back up. All right, and typically there are lots of different impairment tests. They depend on the type of asset. So you have, equipment, you have financial instruments. Different financial instruments have different impairment tests. Different intangibles have different impairment tests. We'll get more into the details, but I just mean to say that, there's usually a test that says, is it impaired, yes or no? And then if so, what are we going to write it down to? Technically, under the codification, if you use the codification, or when you start to use the codification, impairment is when an item held at cost is below its fair value, and that's true, but not always do we record the impairment. So I don't like to mess those two things up, because at this point we can think of impairment testing as we're going to look at the specific impairment testing for the specific type of intangible, and we're going to apply it. So it's very methodical process. When you have a problem in front of you. In the real world, it is actually the trickiest part we're not going to do, which are all the valuations. So just as a kind of heads up with respect to practice, impairment testing is always, or often, there's a lot of judgment involved, and oftentimes you're dealing with gray areas. So, but in our problems, we'll give you the number, and it'll be clear which way to go. All right, so once again, the cycle, we're really talking about the cycle for different types of intangibles. How do we acquire it? If we acquire it, how do we expense it? If we get rid of it, what's the disposal accounting? And every year we have to test for impairment, and how do we go about that? And if it is impaired, how do we measure it? All right, so instead of one type of accounting, we're doing the accrual process applied to different types of intangibles. Okay, so that's kind of the 35,000 foot view.